I think domestic homicides reviews honor victims and survivors of this violence. It allows us to look at to what extent can we prevent these tragedies and similar circumstances in the future.
Domestic violence fatality review is a way of identifying homicides and suicides that are caused by, related to, or somehow traceable to domestic violence. It's also a way of analyzing those deaths very closely, usually producing some kind of chronological timeline of the events, identifying what the antecedents or the red flags were in those cases, identifying the agencies that were involved prior to the killing, the community members that were involved, and the degree of coordination between those entities, and then finally coming up with some kind of set of recommendations about how we could do things differently and making sure that those recommendations are implemented.
I think every life lost, offers a chance for some lessons to be learned. I mean, it's something that's important for everyone, whether you're a family member, a friend, a coworker, whether you're a frontline professional, police officer, a teacher who may have a child living with violence in their home. I think it's incumbent on the whole community to do what they can to prevent these tragedies.
In the United States at the moment, there are currently about 40 states that have some semblance of domestic violence fatality review. I'm currently the director of the National Domestic Violence Fatality Review in the United States, and we have our website, for example, where we have state reports that are accessible to the general public. The website address is ndvfri.org, and folks can go up there and download those reports. Homicide Fatality Review is important because it really brings multiple agency players and community members to the table to explore and examine the death. So the perspectives at the table are diverse. It also involves bringing a lot of different people who knew victims and perpetrators to the table, and in some cases perpetrators themselves are interviewed, perhaps while they're in prison. So we get a lot of information at the table. It's a chance to see things with a wide-angled lens and try to recreate the death through the eyes of the victim, ideally, to get a sense of the compromises that she faced on her way through to her demise.
So the Domestic Violence Death Review Committee is something that arose as a result of 2 or 3 very high-profile inquests that took place in the province of Ontario, focusing on the issue of domestic violence. And 2 of those inquests had recommendations that the chief coroner, rather than having an inquest repeatedly on domestic violence death situations, should have a committee that starts to study and look at this, so that in sort of as an alternative to the inquest process, we would have an ongoing mechanism to monitor these deaths, to gather statistics, to learn from them, and constantly make recommendations to move governments, agencies, and other organizations forward in how they approach these types of deaths.
One of the things that's most striking from our reviews is that the vast majority of homicides appear predictable and preventable with hindsight. That is, if you look at all the factors, once we've reviewed these tragedies, about 86% of them have 7 or more risk markers that indicate that, certainly with hindsight, there are things that we could have done or should have done to prevent these tragedies. And by risk factors are things such as a recent separation, a history of violence, stalking behavior, depression, suicidal ideation, things that were known to friends, family, coworkers, often mental health professionals, but nobody ever put the pieces together. So I think our lesson really is that information is often there, that these deaths don't happen out of the blue. They're not an act of passion. They're usually acts that involve intent, planning, and ones that appear preventable and certainly predictable based on our review.
The other things that we do are track the agencies or organizations that have been recognized as being involved with the care or management of that particular family. So it may include healthcare professionals like doctors and nurses in hospitals. It may include the school. It may include children's aid societies. It may include other healthcare professionals, policing agencies, the courts, and so on. And look at those as agencies that potentially had they recognized that this was a scenario or a circumstance that was escalating in terms of severity of assaults or the domestic dispute that was going on, may have had an opportunity, coming back to those risk factors, had they recognized some of them, that they might have intervened or might have intervened more effectively to ultimately prevent the homicide.
The committees differ very much in terms of how they do their work. Some committees basically gather aggregate data and large amounts of it for the purposes of proposing legislative change, for example. Other committees review far fewer cases, but they review them in great detail. So some of the reviews tend to be more quantitative, others tend to be more qualitative and more highly subjective. To give you an example, in Montana, they will go to a community and spend 2 days in a community with a facilitator doing a death review. They will bring in testimony from witnesses, from family members, from other agency players who were involved in the case, and really unravel and unpick the case and come up with very detailed recommendations. They'll do that twice in a year in Montana, once in October, once in May. Now, in other states where perhaps there are more domestic violence-related homicides, they will perhaps look more cursorily at the death and process more cases. So it just depends on really the way in which the team decides to operate, the kind of scope the team would have, the kind of cases that the team would choose to review, and the depth in which they want to proceed.
What we can't do is get into the areas that occur in many other jurisdictions where they bring in victims that have not necessarily been the tragic result of a homicide, but have been subjected to domestic assault, domestic abuse for years, and learn from their experiences as well.
I would like to see as a committee, sort of structurally, that we actually have better representation from ethno-racial, cultural folks, and that we place a greater emphasis on approaching our work as a committee within a culturally competent framework.
A lot of these teams, when they first started out, they were really focusing on increasing understanding of domestic violence fatalities, getting a sense of what the risk factors were, what the gaps in the system response were. And typically, they would then make a report that they'd publish and make it publicly available with a list of recommendations. What these teams realized over time is that these recommendations weren't often being implemented, particularly if they weren't involved in any way in trying to implement them. So some of these teams are then trying to move now from increasing understanding as their primary goal to facilitating action. So they're actually trying to think about how can we help to implement these recommendations. A variety of strategies they're using are, in one situation, they're trying to monitor whether these recommendations are implemented. So it's almost a sense of increasing accountability by following up. Do you know about this recommendation? Have you implemented it? What's happening? Any problems? Some of them are actually assisting other services in implementing those recommendations. That is particularly easier for people who are actually involved in the agencies where the recommendation is directed to. And then sometimes what they're doing is they're reporting the actions taken by the services that the recommendations were directed to in the report. So again, that's another sense of sort of accountability or celebrating some of the changes that have been made. And if there were times where recommendations weren't implemented, it's an opportunity for services or agencies to talk about why it wasn't. Maybe it wasn't a good fit. Maybe it was already being done. Maybe there are barriers they couldn't overcome. So really trying to move from understanding to action is a really promising practice that a lot of the teams are really considering at this point.
As a committee, I think we could do a lot of really good work if we could actually go to the communities where the death has occurred. I think there are incredible lessons for us to learn. I think that there are ways in which that process can be very healing for communities and put them back on track and allow them to grieve and move forward in preventing domestic homicide.
The best practices for me are the ones that get closer to the lived experience of victims and the compromises that they faced. And that to me is the most important thing, because I think that if we are going to prevent these tragedies, then we really have to see the case not through the eyes of the experts who design all these interventions, or the service providers who provide them. Because it's very easy for those folks to talk about the logical array of services that are laid out and suggest that a person go here or there or whatever. But what victims often see, we find, is sort of a maze that doesn't appear necessarily logical or utilizable. So we really need to get closer to that victim's perspective to understand why it was that they made certain decisions.
This process is not about finding blame. It's really about looking at what could we do differently in the future.
We've worked hard in Ontario to get homicides reviewed to the extent to which there's a collective sense of responsibility that people can do a better job. It's not a question of laying blame and pointing fingers and saying, well, somebody screwed up or messed up. But really we want people to say that with every tragedy there's a lesson to be learned. What we like to see is people move beyond our province, and we want to see this as a national initiative. We'd like to see every province and territory across Canada actively review domestic homicides. We'd like to see the best lessons that we can learn from across the country. You know, if you're in rural Manitoba, you know, there's lessons that could be learned that would benefit rural Ontario. If you're working in an Aboriginal community in the Cornwall area, we'd like to see that those lessons to be, you know, go to Williams Lake in British Columbia. We want to make sure that every part of this country learns lessons from homicides, and we think more actively about preventing these tragedies. Domestic homicides are the most predictable and preventable of all homicides, and I think we owe it to victims and survivors to do the best we can across this country in all sectors, and we hope this could be part of a national movement.